I would like to welcome you all to our joint consumer protection webinar hosted by ESCWA in collaboration with UNCTAD. I am pleased to see so many participants from all around the world with us today. Today we will discuss the complex challenges created by the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on consumers. The crisis also fueled a digital surge, and the e-commerce sector has been booming since. However, consumers faced a range of unfair business practices and left the most vulnerable ones even more disadvantaged. The crisis illustrated that firmer government action is needed to protect consumers from such unfair, misleading, and abusive business practices. ESCWA and UNCTAD partnered to promote consumer protection in the Arab region and facilitate the sharing of information between consumer protection agencies. With today's webinar, we hope to create a platform that allows national consumer protection agencies to share their experience and learn from best practices, both from the Arab region and the international community. Before we start with our today's webinar and give the floor to our speakers, I would like to inform you about some logistical matters. First of all, translation from English to Arabic and vice versa will be available throughout the webinar. You will be able to see the translations in the live chat box. Second, if any questions arise during the webinar that you would like our speakers to address, you can still submit these questions through the registration form or add them to the YouTube comment box. Unfortunately, we will not be able to answer all questions in the webinar. If your question was not addressed, we will reach out to you by email with an answer from our speakers. Last but not least, I kindly ask all our speakers to consider the time limitation in their interventions in order to not to exceed the time frame of our webinar. And now I have the pleasure to give the floor to ESCWA's Deputy Executive Secretary, Mr. Mounir Tabet, to give the introductory remarks. Mr. Tabet, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
صباح الخير جميعا وكل عام وانتم بخير. Excellencies, dear colleagues from UNCTAD and ESCWA, dear colleagues from various government entities, ladies and gentlemen, أستميحكم عذرا لأن تكون كلمتي في الإنجليزية للوصول للغير متحدثين في العربية. I'm pleased to welcome you to this joint ESCWA webinar on consumer protection in the Arab region. As has become customary now, our meeting is taking place virtually. Yet one more indicator that the world post-COVID-19 is fundamentally different than it was pre-COVID-19. The world is gradually evolving its thinking beyond assessing the impact of COVID-19 towards adapting to a new reality that is still emerging and whose final shape may not be known for years. We are in the proverbial process of changing the tires on the car while driving it. Complex, unknown, but necessary shifts are beginning to take shape. So what does it all mean in relation to consumer protection? We know that the pandemic has accelerated the shift towards digitalization, providing consumers with new digital solutions. At the same time, consumers have been victims or the prey to a new range of unfair business practices. For example, excessive prices have made it impossible to afford basic goods and medical equipment, such as masks and hand sanitizers. Moreover, consumers have been exploited by deceptive online marketing techniques, which falsely claim that a product can prevent or cure an infection of the virus. In this context, as in many similar contexts, the most vulnerable are more prone to be the victims. We have a responsibility in helping to protect them. Collaboration and cooperation at all levels is necessary to overcome the overall challenges of the global pandemic. The same is true for helping to protect consumers and to achieve the yet greater goal of realizing the Agenda 2030. We at ESCWA have partnered with UNCTAD. Our partnership is old on many issues, but we have recently partnered with them in a joint activity in the area of consumer protection. UNCTAD is the focal point within the UN system for consumer protection, while ESCWA draws on an extensive base of knowledge and experiences in the Arab region. Both organizations are committed to combining their expertise in order to better support Arab member states in strengthening the protection of consumer rights. With this webinar today, we hope to provide some additional support to consumer protection agencies in the Arab region to reach a deeper understanding of consumer protection post-COVID-19, and in exploring possible options and practices to enhance such protection. We intend to create a multi-stakeholder platform that fosters the exchange of information between consumer protection agencies in the region. Moreover, we would like to build on the momentum of the webinar and offer additional initiatives in the area of consumer protection in collaboration with UNCTAD in the near future. Today's webinar provides an opportunity for Arab consumer protection authorities to share the experiences they have made since the beginning of the crisis, the challenges consumers have faced in their countries, and the measures they have taken to protect consumer rights in these turbulent times. The webinar allows them and us to exchange expertise and to learn from best practices, both from the Arab region and from other regions, as well as from the international community specialized agencies of the UN and other agencies. Additionally, esteemed regional and international experts will point out priorities and recommendations for the region in adjusting to the new challenges and discuss the accelerating shift towards digitization. I would like to thank all speakers and organizers for their unwavering commitment and all participants for showing interest and commitment in this important topic. I'm looking forward to a very successful webinar that will provide all of us with valuable insights and information. Thank you all. I now give the floor back to my colleague, Ms. Natalie Khaled.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tabet, for this introduction, which has set the pace for our discussions today. I would like now to introduce Dr. Mohammed Abu Haidar, the Director General of the Lebanese Ministry of Economy, who will also give us some introductory remarks. Dr. Haidar, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Is it okay?
Yes, we can hear you very well. However, we cannot see you.
Okay, it's fine. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me a great pleasure to participate in this webinar entitled Consumer Protection in the Aftermath of the COVID-19 Pandemic, Focus on Digitalization. Allow me first of all to thank the UNSCWA and UNCTAD for inviting me to speak in the opening of this very important meeting and very interesting, especially during this critical period. So with the outbreak of the COVID-19, the global economy is facing its biggest danger since 2018 financial crisis. Containing the epidemic, sustaining livelihoods, and protecting people have surged to become every country's ultimate priorities. Substantial targeted policies have been designed to support economies through this phase, keeping intact the economic and financial relationships between workers and businesses, lenders and borrowers, and suppliers and end users for activity to be sustained once the outbreak fades. These policies have been primarily aimed at improving the business environment, focusing on improving consumer and investor confidence that have dropped dramatically. Looking closer into the impact of this pandemic on consumers worldwide, several factors have determined the change in consumer behaviors, especially with the consumers reining their spending and altering their choice of where to spend their cash. As such, consumer spending proved once again to be one of the most important driving forces for global economic growth. Despite the decline in spending on non-essential products, there has been a prominent surge in spending on others, including groceries, household supplies, fitness products, and apparel. In fact, there has also been, if you want, some attack in e-commerce trend, a trend that is expected to last well into the decade. With this shift to digitalization and more reliance on online activities, and the webinar proved this one now, many opportunities have arisen and yet several challenges have appeared, forcing governments and specialized consumer protection agencies to design the appropriate solutions to mitigate any resulting negative impact on consumers, mainly by, first, ensuring the protection of consumer health and safety and addressing unfair commercial practice through awareness campaign. Then, designing online portals and providing consumers with digital tools to facilitate their filing of complaints. 3, sharing knowledge and experience on best practices for consumer education, enforcement, dispute resolution, and compensation. Ladies and gentlemen, the Consumer Protection Directorate in the Lebanese Ministry of Economy and Trade is committed to providing the highest quality service for consumers in Lebanon with an overall aim of ensuring that a safe, fair trading environment exists for consumers and the traders equally. Prior to the outbreak of the COVID-19, the Lebanese economy has been, if you want, facing this economic crisis marked by the phase 2 depreciation of the Lebanese lira that has led to ongoing price hikes and increase in misconduct by traders. As such, the Directorate further strengthened its service by increasing its routine inspection that have totaled 1905 since the beginning of 2020, resulting in the detection of more than 1,500 violations. In addition to providing advice to business, raising awareness, investigation all complaints to make sure that unfair practices are addressed. Moreover, and beside the available hotline for consumers to submit their complaints, the Directorate has also made available WhatsApp number, an email, and online a platform accessible on the ministry's website in order to expedite the process and allow for a greater number of citizens to voice their concerns. It's worth noting in this regard that the Directorate operates in 30% of its capacity, whereby an additional of 200 inspectors are needed to fully cover all Lebanese territories. With that being said, the ministry's focus remains to ensure the safety and empowerment of individuals in the marketplace based on consumer rights to build a fair, safe, resilient, and sustainable economy, regardless of all the challenges it's facing. Finally, and given the importance of this topic in this critical phase that the world is passing through, let alone the economic and social crisis that Lebanon is witnessing, the ministry attaches a great importance to this webinar to learn about new ways and best practices to address issues at scale, including scams, negligent business practices, and misinformation. This is very important. Lastly, allow me to thank you once again, UNCTAD, ESCWA, for inviting me to speak at this event, and I'm looking forward to the discussions and resulting recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed Abu Haidar, for your valuable contribution and for sharing some insights about the situation in Lebanon, which becomes really more challenging in terms of mitigating the crisis amid the current economic and social turmoil that's happening currently. Last but not least, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Teresa Morera, the head of the Competition and Consumer Policies branch at UNCTAD and our co-organizer in this webinar today. Teresa, please, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Good morning to all our colleagues, to our participants. On behalf of UNCTAD, I would like, first of all, to really thank ESCWA colleagues, in this case, Natalie Khaled's team, and of course, greeting Dr. Mounir Tabet and Dr. Nibal Idlebi for their engagement in this webinar. We are really delighted that we had this opportunity of strengthening our cooperation, which was initially launched in our other mandate, which is competition law and policy. We do think that it is extremely timely, as previous speakers have underlined, to address consumers' challenges brought by the outbreak of the pandemic, because as our predecessors have already addressed, we have seen the rise of fraudulent, misleading business practices, and consumers, due to the confinement conditions and due to the uncertainty, the fear, the misinformation often existing, have been increasingly exposed to unfair business practices that probably in usual times they could handle in a more satisfactory way. So this is a very important topic. You should remember that across the globe, in some continents, at least where we are in Europe, governments are already committed to economic recovery plans that have been discussed, approved in the past month or so. But this does not mean to say that the challenges that consumers face due to the pandemic are behind us, unfortunately. And I think it is extremely important that we are able to gather these experiences from our colleagues in the Arab region, to learn from your needs, from your interests, from your challenges, and to work together trying to best tackle them, promoting cooperation at international and at regional level. I will say a few words on the technical issues that are under UNCTAD'S mandate, but I'm very, very grateful again to ESCWA for having approached us to jointly organize this webinar. And I would like to send a special thanks to our colleagues from a number of consumer protection agencies that UNCTAD has had the pleasure of working with lately in a technical cooperation project, UNCTAD Middle East and North Africa Competition and Consumer Protection Program. And also to our two experts, Dr. Christine Reif and Ms. Liz Cole, that are partners and friends, and that we are certain will provide the best of their expertise, which is absolutely top-notch to our discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your introductory words, Teresa. And we, in our end, thank you and your team for your contribution and the organization of this webinar and for sharing your valuable expertise. Let us begin now with our first panel. The COVID-19 pandemic affected every country in the world and had a significant impact on consumers. While it accelerated digitization and created many new opportunities, it also exposed consumers to a range of new unfair business practices, including excessive pricing and misleading advertisements. I would like to introduce our first speaker of the day, my colleague, Dr. Nibal Idlebi, who is the Chief of the Innovation Section at ESCWA. Nibal, please provide us with a snapshot on the performance of the Arab region in terms of digital economy trends, products, and challenges. You have 10 minutes, please, to elaborate on this topic.
Do you hear me, Natalie?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, very good. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to colleagues at UNCTAD, at ESCWA, and good morning to all participants in this webinar. I'm really delighted to be part of the story and to be part of the consumer protection webinar. In my presentation, I will brief you about the situation of digital economy and digital development in the Arab region, which is the base, I believe, for consumer protection, especially for the online and purchase and online businesses. I hope you are. Do you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Then I will.
Nibal, I think you are cut. You're cut off. We lost you. Nibal, can you hear us? I think we lost Ms. Edlibe, but maybe for the sake of time, we can move on to our second speaker in this panel today, and then maybe we can get back to Ms. Edlibe at a later stage. I would like to pose a question to our co-host, Ms. Teresa Moreira from UNCTAD, who will provide us with an international perspective of the pandemic impact on consumer. Teresa, how did the COVID-19 crisis impact consumers, and what are the most common unfair business practices and challenges that emerged as a result of the pandemic? Please, Teresa, the floor is now yours for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Let me just share my presentation. I hope you are able to see it right now.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much. Again, just for some of you who don't know, let me just underline that UNCTAD has a broad mandate. Is one of the agencies within the United Nations system, actually a part of the UN Secretariat, with a broad mandate on trade and development, established in 1964 with 195 members, that basically works around three pillars of work: consensus building through intergovernmental deliberations, research and analysis, and technical cooperation. I just mentioned the UNCTAD MENA competition and consumer protection program that went on from 2015 to 2018, and that was funded by Sweden, where we actually had a very interesting opportunity of gathering not only representatives from government and consumer protection agencies, but representatives from consumer associations, business associations, academics, the judiciary. So it was a multi-stakeholder program and dialogue that really brought together a number of colleagues from the Arab region, even though only from 7 member states. So UNCTAD is indeed the focal point for both consumer protection law and policy as competition law and policy. What exactly does this mean? This means that UNCTAD is formally the custodian of the United Nations guidelines for consumer protection, that this year celebrate 35 years and that were lastly revised in 2015, which allowed for the modernization of its scope and to really include recommendations on emerging challenges that consumers face nowadays, namely on e-commerce, financial services, good business practices, dispute resolution and redress, and international cooperation. UNCTAD, due to its role, was very active during the, first the confinement months, but of course during the period that we have all been enduring, and in some cases are still enduring, of the lockdown. And for this reason, we contacted our consumer protection agencies from our counterparts, trying to gather all relevant information on measures, initiatives, actions being undertaken, and sharing this information, because as you can imagine, consumer protection agencies of developing countries, or in some cases of least developed countries that may not even have yet a specific dedicated consumer protection body in their country, were in need of learning what neighbors or partners were doing to tackle the challenges brought by the pandemic. So we actually released 3 news items, 2 of them on consumer protection issues, one on firmer action needed to better protect consumers. You have the links in the screen. The last one on the refunds for airline tickets, because this is an issue that has been rising all over the world, and in several cases, due to the financial situation of airline companies, governments may feel tempted to dedicate more attention to the bailout of the companies and not necessarily grant the full respect of consumer rights regarding the reimbursement of tickets. What kind of practices, to reply to Natalie, what kind of practices have we seen on the rise during the pandemic months? I would say, just to sum up, you're looking at the screen to a summary of the key practices and of the key reactions we witnessed. But I would say that my first point would be that I and UNCTAD, we were extremely happy to see that consumer protection agencies were in the front line of the responses against market behavior due to the pandemic. So what we started to notice was very strong law enforcement and market monitoring against a number of practices that spread regarding key products like masks and sanitizers, but also key consumer goods of food or essential goods for the households. Also, a number of misleading advertising and scams trying to make the most out of the uncertainty, the fear, the concern of consumers, and the refund policies that I just mentioned. I should say also that in any case, some of these practices led to very quick reaction from governments through legislative measures. And here I would like to underline that from our point of view, that was, let's say, a strength that consumer protection agencies, because they are usually within the government structures, so the consumer protection agencies were able to influence governments to adopt, when necessary, exceptional legislation trying to contain the most dangerous, the most serious, unfair and misleading and fraudulent business practices. For instance, imposing price caps of some products, which of course is a serious intervention in market functioning, but it was extremely needed in order to make sure that the normal supply of essential consumer goods and services took place. Another interesting legislative measure that we identified in a number of countries and continents was the prohibition of service cuts due to the non-payment of some utilities, again, trying to maintain minimal conditions of supply of comfort to consumers that in most cases were confined for several months. The same thing regarding fees that were being charged by banks or financial services providers due to the rise of online transactions, for instance. So I would underline the fact that consumer policy was in the front line, that consumer protection agencies across the world, this was not exclusive from developed countries. On the contrary, we saw countries in Latin America, in Africa, well, in the Arab region, in Asia, taking action in a very quick way. What I wanted also to underline is that the fact that several of these consumer protection agencies are engaged in collaboration, in cooperation with their neighbors, so often within the regional setting, but also at international level, was extremely helpful. And especially because what we can say is that the pandemic is obviously transnational, and a number of reactions, however, were at national level. So it was extremely important for consumer protection agencies to share this information and realize that often the rogue traders were exactly the same, were global or traders operating at a regional level, and that through exchange of information and even if possible coordinated cross-border enforcement, they could better address these issues. So this is just a very brief summary of what we have seen. Again, I cannot really say that we identified practices that were new between brackets or unusual. I would, however, underline that vulnerable and disadvantaged consumers were really more exposed than usual, so they were worse off than most other groups of consumers. And as we know, under the heading of vulnerable and disadvantaged consumers, you have specifically groups, and most of them are extremely different from each other. And this, of course, depends very much on the conditions of the country. So the elderly, who in general were not familiar with digital tools, with digitalization, and were therefore in a worse condition than let's say young and digital vibrant consumers. Families with low income, because they could not necessarily accede to tablets, to smartphones that could allow, for instance, children to follow classes online. Immigrants, because typically they are less integrated than consumers that were born in a certain country. And of course, consumers with little education, because usually the lack of access to education, to information, obviously puts consumers in a more disadvantaged position. I'm not going to really enter into the digital divide because there is a panel to address this, but I think that more than ever, we saw how we depend on the digitalization of the economy, and this really requires very concrete action from consumer protection agencies to empower consumers, to promote their access to the digital devices they need to be fully empowered, to be fully integrated. But also this requires very strong vigilance from consumer protection agencies of all practices that are now being identified in the digital setting. Well, UNCTAD, in its last newsletter, identified 5 points for action from consumer protection agencies. This again touch upon the topics that I already referred. So the importance of raising awareness and informing consumers, so alerting them to these scams and to these misleading, unfair business practices. So just to try to contribute to their empowerment. Second, the market monitoring and strict law enforcement. Third, the use of digital tools to reach out to consumers, to inform them, to allow them to contact the authorities, to allow them to complain, and to use digital tools also for dispute resolution and redress. Something interesting was that we identified a number of actions of outreach of consumer agencies to businesses, so to major online platforms, engaging with them, appealing to them to identify road traders, so having them to collaborate with agencies, with authorities in order to increase consumer protection. The needs of vulnerable and disadvantaged consumers that I already mentioned, and of course, coming from UNCTAD, cooperation with other consumer protection agencies at bilateral, regional, and international level. I'm getting to the end. Just to say, as I was saying in the beginning, that the pandemic really highlighted the needs, the importance, and the relevance of active consumer protection policy across the globe. Right now, that a number of countries and continents are already focusing on how to launch economic recovery through a number of public funds and public measures, it is extremely important that this will not reduce consumer rights, and that consumer protection and consumer interests are considered in all policy areas, in particular of vulnerable and disadvantaged consumers. And for this reason, I strongly encourage consumer protection agencies to engage with each other, to engage with international organizations such as UNCTAD, with ESCWA as a regional economic commission, with international networks such as ISPAN, and of course, I'm not going to mention all the other partners of ours. I will finish saying that UNCTAD is very well placed to provide this unique international forum for discussion of all issues pertaining to consumer protection policy, and we stand ready to assist our member states. Allow me just to finish by underlining that in October, we will hold the 8th UN Conference on Competition and Consumer Protection in Geneva that will combine in-person sessions with remote attendance. And there are several topics of relevance pertaining to consumer protection law and policy that are extremely relevant to the post-pandemic situation. For instance, a session on strengthening consumer protection and competition in a digital economy, international enforcement cooperation, improving consumer product safety worldwide, and we will have the high-level segment on leaving no one behind, the contribution of consumer policy to the post-COVID-19 era. I'm very happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Teresa, for this informative intervention. I am also pleased that to report that Dr. Nibal Idilbi is back with us. Dr. Nibal, who is the Chief of the Innovation Section at ESCWA, will give us a regional overview on the performance of the Arab region in terms of digital economy trends and challenges. Dr. Idilbi, you have the floor for 10 minutes to elaborate on this topic, please.
Thank you very much, and I'm sorry for the technical issue that I had. Okay, I will share directly my presentation, and I hope that it will work this time. Okay, then in fact, about digital development in the Arab region, in fact, we cannot speak about the region as a whole as one entity. Arab region is very heterogeneous in digital development, and mainly we can identify at least three clusters. The first cluster is about the GCC country, which includes 6 Arab countries. And the second cluster, it includes some country which has medium income in general and which doesn't really have a crisis for the time being, or it is not in post-conflict situation. And the other cluster, in fact, the third one, it is really countries which are either least developed or they are post-affected by crisis, very serious crisis in the last years. Then we can distinguish these 3 clusters, and we cannot say the same model apply for all. It is really 3 categories in all areas of digital development. One of the most important elements in for e-commerce and for businesses, it is the ICT infrastructure. And if we look at the ICT infrastructure in the Arab region, keeping in mind the differentiation between clusters, we can say that the Arab region, unfortunately today, the average of the Arab region is a little bit less than the world average, but it is not so far from the world average in general. This is for internet connectivity, and for mobile, it is the same situation. If we look at mobile connectivity, it is always a little bit less than the world average. However, the issue of the Arab region is mainly in the broadband, which is very important for the quality of service and for the having quick interaction. One of the challenge in the Arab region in terms of infrastructure is the affordability, because till now it is quite expensive, the internet services and the mobile services in most of the countries. Additionally, there is gaps, and the gaps in the Arab region are increasing recently. We can speak about gender digital gap. We speak about digital gap between rural and urban area, as well as digital gap among countries. And unfortunately, for example, in terms of gender digital gap, the gender gap was in 2013, it was much less than today in the Arab region. Then this is really not helping for achieving leaving no one behind in terms of digital development. This is about digital infrastructure, but what about digital economy in the Arab region? Mainly the dominant in the Arab region in digital economy is the telecom sector. And we can see that the telecom sector, it is really the biggest one. In the telecom area, we can see it is more operator owned by the government, and they have relatively good contribution to GDP. It varies among countries between 0.6 to 6% of the GDP. There are many ICT companies. However, these companies are characterized by the fact they are small. The number of employees vary between 5 to 100 employees. Their contribution to GDP, unfortunately, not very well defined. It is not well identified in a way or another, as there is lack of statistics, information about such kind of SMEs. Most of the companies in the Arab region focus on mobile internet provision, computer services, and software development. And we can say that the Arab region, for the time being, they are more consumer of the technology rather than a producer. All of these services are mostly for serving the local community, but we are not contributing really to the global market in terms of technology development. Maybe the most important one is software development, which satisfy the local need. And today we can find some applications which are worldwide, but their contribution to GDP is still weak. One of the characteristics that characterize the sector also that there isn't enough research and development in the ICT companies. This is demonstrate the fact that we are more consumer than producer. However, in one of our recent publication about Arab digital development, which is Arab Digital Development Report, we were able to collect some information about ICT company. For example, in Jordan, we find there is about 700 ICT companies, some of them working in software, others working on data processing and so on. And the e-commerce per se contribute a little bit to 10% to the revenue in this sector in Jordan. And there are some contribution. It is not well studied in all over the country. There are some good examples, however. In another area, which is also, the e-services, which is very important for the digital world and for digital development, we can identify at least there is the e-government services, the e-commerce, the e-payment, in addition to e-health as well as e-learning. If we look at these e-services, the most developed one, maybe it is the e-government one. And in the e-government also, if we look at one of the latest statistics provided by UNCTAD'S, we can see that according to the e-government development index, we can see there are 7 Arab countries only which are higher than the world average. And if we look at these countries, we can see that they are the GCC country plus Tunisia in this case. The other Arab region, we see the variation and the gap between countries in terms of e-government. In e-commerce, the situation even is, it is not very as developed as in e-government, in fact, unfortunately. E-commerce, we don't have enough statistics. However, we can say that there is a lot of potential for e-commerce, especially now with COVID, after COVID-19. There are some studies which shows that the e-commerce, maybe it is the fastest growing e-commerce in the world, especially if we look at e-government at Gulf country, in fact. Till today, the estimate online sale in Middle East, doesn't exceed 2% of the total retail revenue, as opposed to 15% in the more developed region. Then the contribution of e-commerce is really very weak in the Arab region. There are some good examples, and there are some estimates that there is a lot of potential for e-commerce. For example, a study showed that maybe in the Gulf state, in the Gulf, in the GCC country, they estimate the e-commerce to be of the value of $20 billion by 2020. I don't know if we achieved this number, but I believe it was a kind of forecasting which showed that there are a lot of potential. E-payment is available, which is very important. E-payment for e-commerce, as you know, e-payment is available in many countries. However, it is more for accounts, for bank account holder, but not for individual who doesn't have bank account in the country. In Africa, we know that there are many e-payment solutions for those even who don't have bank accounts. However, in the Arab region, is still weak. There are many platforms for e-commerce in the Arab region. These are some of them, and we can speak about there is some competition between different platforms in terms of a product, in terms of best price, in terms of qualities of services, and so on. And there are few that appearing, as I mentioned. There is, for example, Souk.com, which was very successful, and it was bought by Amazon.com. There is today Noon.com, which serves mainly the Gulf countries, and there is Wadi.com. Then there are some competition. There are others which serve in Jordan and others in Tunisia for the national market, not really necessarily at a cross-border for the time being, except maybe in GCC, because there are some agreements between GCC country, and therefore there are some sub-regional, let us say, exchange of product and so on. But what is the enabling environment? You are more expert than me on the enabling environment for e-commerce and for the e-services in general. But we can, if we look at the enabling environment of e-commerce in the Arab region, and we look at 4 dimensions which are recognized by UNCTAD as the most important enabling component for the e-commerce. We can speak about infrastructure, internet access, legislation. Of course, we can speak about, there are many legislation which affects the e-commerce, like e-transaction, e-signature, e-payment, and of course, e-consumer law, as well as consumer protection on the cyberspace. There is for sure another one which is quite important, which cybercrime, especially for dealing with financial crime and so on. Another dimension which is very important is the enforcement of law and having some institution for the enforcement of law at at national level and eventually at a cross-border level. Another element which is very important, however, it's quite weak in the Arab region, is the delivery of goods. And we need really reliable postal services in order to have e-commerce work properly in the Arab region and elsewhere, of course. If we look at the cyber legislation in the Arab region, we can see that from this slide that there are many laws, in fact, in the Arab countries, and that they have, most of them, in fact, they have e-transaction, e-signature, and even e-commerce law, except a few. Maybe here we see Iraq, for example, and Palestine, who doesn't have necessarily a specific law for e-commerce. Then the laws are exist, and they are really, some of them are recent, some of them, I mean, are a little bit older. However, there is always revision for this law, which is in a way promising for the Arab region. Then laws are here, however, for the enforcement of these laws, the same apply for cybercrime. We can see that in the Arab region, in the last 10 years, in fact, a lot of laws was formulated, adopted even at national level. Then this is really a good stand to start with for the enabling environment, especially in the legislation. I would like to mention here that the enforcement, it is relatively weak in many countries. There are some institutions who try to apply this law, but I can say that the challenge for the Arab region today is more the enforcement of this law rather to have this law as they are already there. And if I rely a little bit on one of the index of the e-commerce, UNCTAD'S business to consumer e-commerce index, which this index, it was published in 2019, the last edition of it. And this index, in fact, it measures well the enabling environment of e-commerce, I would say, rather than the product and the sales in the e-commerce itself. This index, in fact, it relies on 4 components, sub-indexes: internet penetration, e-payment accounts, security of online services, and postal reliability. And if we look at the shape of the Arab region, we see the diversification and that it is heterogeneous. And we can see in the leading agency, the leading countries are the GCC, as I mentioned earlier, as well as in this case, we have Lebanon, Tunisia, who have always also a good shape, relatively good shape, as they are so close to the world average in this index. This is the situation in the Arab region and in this index, which is maybe very important for this webinar. But if we look at the numbers and we look deeper in the analysis of this index, we can see where there is a weakness in the Arab region and in which country and how they are evaluated. If we look at the regional average and we compare it with the world average, we can see that for the internet penetration, the situation is relatively fine. In the share of individual in e-money, here we have a problem. I mean, we see that the regional average is 48.5%, while if the world average is 60, then our region is behind the other region in the world. The same applied to secure internet server. Then security, which is very important for e-commerce and for consumer in general, it is also weak in the Arab region, as well as the reliability of the postal services. The postal services really, it's very weak, and in some country, if we look at some country, we feel that it is really if it doesn't exist in a way. However, we have some brilliant country where if you look at the UAE, which is leading the region, we can see that the value of their indexes is really high. And they are really in very good shape. Then we cannot judge all countries in the same way in the Arab region, and we have really to make distinction among countries and among the digital gaps between countries. I think I will go directly to the recommendation because of time. My recommendation for enhancing digital economy in the Arab region, I can summarize them by the need really to to move towards digital economy, as it is very important for knowledge society in the Arab region and for the diversification of economy. There is a really need to strengthen legal and regulatory framework, especially for the enforcement of law and the protection of people, because anyway, the laws are for the protection of people in all areas. There is a need to collect more statistics and more information about ICT firms, about e-commerce, about the company, about the revenue and how it's their contribution to GDP. There is really a need, and another area, there is a need to make more research and development and innovation for the development of digital economy and the ICT sector in general, especially for the private sector. Private sector really are very weak in this area, and which is, we know that it is digital economy and digital development is very much related to research and development and innovation. There is a need to promote e-commerce by strengthening, first of all, strengthening the enabling environment, especially e-payment system in the Arab region. And I want to thank you.
Thank you very much, Val, for this interesting and informative regional overview on the performance of the Arab region in terms of digital economy plans, which has really become important for consumers in the current crisis, and is also critical to understand the infrastructure in the region and potentials for improving the basis for these platforms in the best manner to promote consumer protection and rights and facilitate safe digital transactions. We now continue with our second panel, in which we will hear from the national perspective of consumer protection agencies from the Arab region. We are delighted that we have expert delegation from Morocco with us today. Our delegate from Morocco will share their experience regarding the challenges that consumers have faced since the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis. They will also introduce us to the measures they have taken to mitigate the impact of the pandemic on consumers in their country. Unfortunately, our delegate speakers from Jordan, who is planned also to speak in this panel, was not able to join us today, and we are unable to connect to them. I am pleased to introduce Ms. Sarah Sherkawi, who is our delegate speaker from Morocco. Ms. Sherkawi is the chief of the Division of Consumer Protection in Morocco. Ms. Sherkawi, I would like to ask you, what are the main challenges consumers have been facing in Morocco since the start of the pandemic, and what are the measures that you have taken by the Division of Consumer Protection in Morocco to protect consumers and moderate the impact of the pandemic in your country? You have, the floor is yours now, please.
Good morning, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So let me try to share my presentation. Okay. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay. So first, I would like to thank you for organizing this webinar and for giving me the opportunity to talk about the measures taken by the Ministry of Industry, Trade and Green and Digital Economy of Morocco to face the COVID-19 pandemic challenges. So Morocco is going through different times in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic that has not excluded any country in the world. So in this context, Morocco has taken measures to limit the spread of this pandemic. And in this regard, and in order to combat the effects of this dangerous pandemic on the national economy and on consumer protection, our department has undertaken a multitude of proactive measures. So first of all, the ministry has initiated a task force working on the impact of the COVID-19 since February 25th. On March 16th, a war room was set up at the ministry, which is a coordination and monitoring cell with stations dedicated to different themes, such as monitoring the market supply situation and prices, feedbacks from the ministry's regional and provincial delegations, investigations on consumers' claims, and steering and data analysis. So to monitor the market supply situation and prices, a station was in charge of the coordination for the handling of food and health products supply issues in close cooperation with the relevant ministries, and conducted a daily follow-up with retailers to monitor the supply of food and sanitary products in the market. The station, for the feedbacks from the ministry's 29 regional and provincial delegations, conducted daily monitoring of the prices of products of basic consumption like flour, oil, sugar, tea, by performing field visits. We had a daily statistical reporting of store openings and closings, especially for grocery stores, fruit and vegetables, bakeries, telecom agencies, specific monitoring of the availability and prices of sanitizers that are heavily used in this period. We provide support and assistance to traders to anticipate any lack of supply of the necessary raw materials. Consumers' claims was handled within a specific station, with which important outcome was the setting of a maximum selling prices for some products that are in high demand during the pandemic, such as sanitizers and face masks, in order to avoid any inflation. The station was in charge of the processing and analysis of consumer claims received via the complaints platform. So about 14,000 complaints was handled. They concerned mainly homeschooling, e-commerce, banking, and cancelled travel. And depending on those complaints, investigations were ordered, resulting in 300 legal actions. Special investigations on possible infringements in relation to face masks was conducted, and the close coordination was maintained with consumer protection, consumer associations in terms of awareness raising. A consolidated dashboard containing all the actions and alerts of the day was produced daily, and the vigilance points reported on the dashboard were analyzed separately to produce recommendations and action plans. In the same time, regulatory measures were taken by drafting of several legislative texts relating to various fields, including mainly the characteristics of face masks made of non-wooden fabric for non-medical use, the list of industries and commerce that may continue to operate during the pandemic, the dematerialization of certain administrative formalities, and the application of provisional measures against the increase in the prices of face masks and sanitizers. After the lockdown, and in order to restart the industrial activity safely, joint local and regional committees monitor the application of precautionary measures within workplaces based mainly on cleanliness and disinfection of the workplace, availability of disinfection products, cleaning products and protective masks, knowledge of precautionary measures against COVID-19, the working conditions, professional meetings, and the company's prevention plan. Regarding the commerce sector, a resumption guide was developed to identify measures to be taken by merchants to reduce the risk of the pandemic. So businesses must comply with a set of measures like provide protection and disinfection products, increase the frequency of cleanings and focus on cleaning the areas most susceptible to the spread of the virus, adopt barriers to limit contact between merchants and customers, and take measures to respect the distance between customers. So in the end, I would like to say that the crisis has enabled us to refocus our priorities and to know the real points to be developed in different areas. And among these points is digitalization. We were aware of its importance, but now more than ever, we are sure that the digital world is the future world. So regarding e-commerce, the Moroccan law on consumer protection had a whole chapter regulating this mode of commerce. And at the level of the Directorate of Consumer Protection, we have a unit for the control of the e-commerce websites that has been operating since 2015. But this type of trade was not very popular in Morocco. However, during this pandemic, we noticed an expansion of the use of e-commerce that we can already see through the increase of complaints in this field. And so, therefore, it is necessary to accompany the development of e-commerce, especially with all the necessary and adequate legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rada Sharkawi, the Chief of the Division of Consumer Protection in Morocco, for sharing this interesting experience of your country in mitigating the challenges of the crisis of consumer and in the move towards digitization. I would like now to move to our third and last panel for today. We will hear from three esteemed international experts what is their take on consumers' increasing reliance on digital platforms since the start of the pandemic and the potential for a shift to digitization and more reliance on online activities in response to and in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. What are possible also post-COVID-19 digital economy solutions needed to facilitate this shift? I would like now to give the floor to our first speaker of this panel, Ms. Liz Cole, who is the former head of digital change at Consumers International. Ms. Cole's intervention will focus on the nature of the shift to online activities in terms of types and volumes of usage, demographics of users, and the potential of digital solutions to help consumers. Please, Ms. Cole, you have 10 minutes to elaborate on these topics. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, let me just... So thank you very much for inviting me to ESCWA and UNCTAD for this kind invitation to participate in this very important webinar today. I'm going to talk about COVID-19 and digitalization and what has changed for consumers. Now, obviously, this is a huge topic and many things have changed. So I'm going to focus mostly on online activities around shopping and e-commerce, but we'll touch on some other things as well. So my presentation will look at what has actually changed, what could be here to stay, what then the significance of this is for consumers, and how do we build future resilience for consumers. So what has actually changed? Well, you won't be surprised to hear that there's been an increase in e-commerce, and mostly that's around food, medical supplies and household essentials. Globally, a third of consumers report more online shopping, according to the Global Web Index, and we've seen quite steep rises in mature digital markets. So, for example, in the US rose from 16 to 27% in April, and in the UK, grocery shopping online doubled in April. We're also seeing similar trends in the ESCWA countries. This is from an Ipsos global survey, and this is consumers reporting that they've been using e-commerce platforms to purchase products they'd usually buy in store. So you can see some quite high rises there, from 63% in Saudi Arabia to 38% in Morocco. And we've also seen an increase in the types of services. So there's been a rise in delivery apps in Saudi Arabia, according to the ITU. And I'm sure across different markets, you will all recognise where different services and apps are coming through. Another thing that's changed is the rise in online banking and payments. So contactless payments in stores are now reported to be used by 79% of people said they would be using them after the pandemic and are using them at high rates now. And that's from a survey from MasterCard. And there were similarly high rates in the GCC countries and ESCWA. There's also been a rise in online payments for utilities and repaying loans, etc. So all of those things that were in place, which were being used by consumers, are now being used by a lot more. On the other side, there's been more exposure to misinformation. This is quite difficult to find evidence for. Everybody talks about there being the infodemic next to the pandemic, but actually it's quite difficult to pull apart figures on things like misinformation and fake news. There's one survey from the UK where 50% of online adults said that they came across false or misleading information about the virus. So that could be an indication of how high these levels are. We've also seen expansions of digital healthcare. So this could be anything from virtual consultations to tracing apps. There are now contact and tracing apps in around 40 countries, although in many cases the take-up is quite low and privacy concerns quite high. We're also seeing some testing out of automated services, so drone deliveries, contactless stores and robots being used to disinfect areas. So there are a few patterns that we're seeing across in different markets. It's difficult to say what could be here to stay, but I think we can be quite sure that the shift to online shopping is one that looks likely to continue. 15% of consumers said their shopping habits had shifted permanently to online. So that's due to worries over physical stores and just feeling generally more comfortable with e-commerce. But other people, there's also high numbers of people who say that their shopping habits have changed slightly, so they'll continue with a mix of physical and online. We'll be seeing and have already seen the closure of physical stores as companies then shift their resources to the e-commerce offer and high streets and empty. We'll probably see more automation and data-led services developing, so supermarkets with no staff, robot drone deliveries perhaps, chatbots for customer service, healthcare and utilities, which again we're already seeing a lot of in developed digital markets. It's likely we'll see non-digital options becoming much more expensive or closing entirely. And around payments and banking, this is quite could be quite a significant issue for those people who are not online. We're also seeing a much higher demand for the 5G rollout that was starting to happen, to be rolled out quicker, to be able to keep up with these demands of automation and data-driven services. One impact on consumers could then be rising costs of devices and data plans, etc. And I think it's highly likely we'll see a lot more use of behavioural and location tracking for public health management, but also for other health issues or mobility, etc. So I think when we think about what could be here to stay, as our previous speakers have said, the differences are stark between regions, between countries, and of course within countries, so across the different demographics. Many of the patterns we've seen had already been emerging slowly, maybe being taken up by early adopters or tested out, but the impact of the pandemic has meant they've accelerated really fast. On the other hand, this acceleration is likely to lead to an amplification of the divides that we have. So we're seeing two things that potentially happening quite quickly and having an impact on those vulnerable and disadvantaged consumers that we talked about in earlier panels. But I think what's quite interesting here is we will continue to live with a pandemic, medium, long term, or with other significant system shocks, whether that's another pandemic, impacts of climate change, etc. So while it's difficult to describe the new normal, because defining normality is almost impossible, I feel there's a sense that these global shocks, which can quickly roll out across different nations and have severe impacts, are going to be here to stay and felt, and that will have an impact on people who are not able to be connected to different ways of accessing services other than physically. So there's a clear need to accelerate solutions on access, affordability, trust and security to ensure some resilience on these future shocks. Just to briefly talk about the significance really for the unconnected or poorly connected consumers if we move to a world of more digitalization and dealing with systemic shocks. So we know just over half the world is connected, and the offline tend to be in poorer countries, and they'll be in the communities that have been hit hardest by the pandemic. We heard from Nibal at ESCWA about online rates in the countries we're talking about here. So it's quite low. The average has been quite low in our countries. Access and devices are not affordable for low-income families, women, the elderly, and connectivity in rural areas is poor or non-existent. This is generally true across the globe, but also reflected in the ESCWA countries. And this reduces access to employment, education, healthcare, etc., and digital banking, shopping remotely, and being able to pay for essential utilities. But there's also issues with digital services and e-commerce for the consumers who are connected. So Consumers International did a survey of consumers in particular MENA countries. This was in 2019, so pre-COVID, but it found there was low trust in online payments, and this is partly due to cash on delivery being much more familiar, unreliable service, lack of easy redress and getting problems put right, and a lack of local language information. So terms and conditions or all sorts of things like that not being available in local languages, and these can all hold back e-commerce. Another global survey found that 85% of people in the MENA region were more concerned with how their data is collected and kept private online, and this compares to about 67% of European consumers as a comparator. And back to the Consumers International survey, 40% of online shoppers reported that they'd been victims of a cybercrime, and 71% had witnessed or had been aware of someone else being victim to a cyber attack. Multinational surveys show similar findings, so people are concerned about their privacy, and it's growing year by year. Lots of data is collected during e-commerce transactions. A third of people actually thinks this is helpful in terms of better products and services. So people are not convinced that this level of data collection is helpful in terms of consumer products. There's a feeling companies have too much power and influence, and there's almost an expectation that that cybercrime is something that you will experience at some point. So there's a slight resignation there to these problems being quite embedded. So just finally, the last slide here, and it's things that we've touched upon earlier, but what needs to be addressed to rebuild the future resilience. I was really struck by the opening remarks about changing tyres on a car while we're driving it, and I think that's a really telling thing. I think when the pandemic first began to peak, there was a sense that we would have the response and then we would have an opportunity to rebuild. At the moment, it feels like we're desperately trying to rebuild and respond at the same time. We need access, we need better trust and confidence in consumer protections, we need to make sure there's relevance and choice, and I think we need to make sure that people have the skills to thrive online, to be able to manage risks and achieve what they want to, and to have their voices heard. Lots of the measurements for skills are about being able to do computer tasks like moving documents or transferring things. But do we really have a good measure of what it means to be a skilled, confident consumer online? I think the final point I want to leave on is that we've seen such great work from consumer protection agencies, also from companies and financial companies enabling later payments or having freezes on loan repayments or access to free, cheaper data or increased bandwidth without additional charges. But if we're in this phase of almost a much longer term response and recovery, how long will those essential supports to consumers continue, or will we see people at the same time that the social protection and financial protection end, seeing some of those things which have really helped them stay online or get online coming to a close as well. So that's the end of my comments today, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for your intervention, Ms. Cole. I now pose the same question to Dr. Christine Rifa, who is the Associate Professor and Reader in Consumer Law from the Brunel Law School in the United Kingdom. Ms. Rifa, do you see a shift to digitization and online activities in response to the COVID pandemic? And what are possible COVID digital economy solutions? Please, Dr. Rifa, the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you very much for having me today. It's a great honour to address all of you. I've had the privilege to look a little bit into media countries when I was working for the UNCTAD team, looking at e-commerce, and it was fascinating to see the differences and at the same time the same problems being there. Today, I want to focus perhaps a little bit more on enforcement and policy making. I have to perhaps explain that I'm an academic, so I don't have to apply things on a daily basis and firefight all the time. So that gives me a bit more room to perhaps look at broader trends and things that I've noticed. To me, the shift to online commerce, I think, will be here to stay. I don't think there's much evidence to indicate that people will go straight back to old habits, especially since the way the pandemic is developing around the world means we thought at first we might just have a big wave and then everything went back to normal. Clearly, I think every country is now realizing this is not the case. So the habits will have time to bed down. And I think because we're also seeing high streets closing and shifting online, it's much harder to reopen a shop on the high street than it is to continue with a website. So I think it's here to stay. So my main comments today, I want to direct them at how enforcement ought to change and how policy making ought to change in order to be able to help and continue to support consumers. A few things that I have seen that I think are perhaps interesting to discuss is the way consumer protection has developed in the past and how I think it was badly equipped to respond to the needs of vulnerable consumers. I think what the pandemic has done is that it's highlighted that vulnerable consumers are not just consumers on low income, are not just consumers who have less education, it's all of us. If you give us the right framework, we are all vulnerable. Suddenly we were not able to get out of our houses. Suddenly we were not able to tell whether a particular product was actually viable or not to service our needs, and we all had to take a chance, providing, of course, we had access online. So I think the nature of vulnerability has really come to the fore. It has been a concern of enforcement and lawmaking in Europe, partly in the US as well for a number of years. It's very fortunately also a concern that's already there in the UN guidelines and has been there for a long time, but it's one that was traditionally given less attention, with this idea that vulnerable consumers were particular groups. So for me, one important take home from the pandemic is to start questioning the way consumer law has been developed. Traditionally, it's based on economic welfare and laws and solutions that are going to be able to enhance economic welfare. It's normally anchored on neoliberal economics. So this idea that if you give consumers the right information, they will make the right choices. And if they make the right choices, then competition law will work. Competition can work, the markets can function, and everyone is happy. The reality, I think, is consumers are not able to privately enforce their rights in many market configurations. That's not to say that it doesn't work, but it has strong limitations. And I think the pandemic again showed that. especially when you are a consumer who in normal times could have asked for a refund on your flight ticket. Suddenly, the response of the airlines were, well, we're not giving them. And in some more extreme cases, governments have supported the issue of vouchers rather than refunds. And that's a clear problem when we look at the way we have relied on consumers to enforce them right, and then suddenly we just pull the carpet away from their feet. So even the ones that were able in the past suddenly were no longer given their rights as consumers, perhaps temporarily, and I can understand in many setups the reasons why those things were done, but I think I want to echo the points that Teresa Moreira made, which is, for me, we need to also be mindful of protecting the sanctity of consumer law. That's how I've called it, for want of a better word, which is this idea that if governments are committing to providing consumer rights, they have to uphold them, they have to enforce them, because otherwise it does also erode the rule of law and the confidence that consumers and citizens have in the way the state is operating. So that's my first point. The sanctity of law and the protection of vulnerable, this should come a lot more to the fore of policymakers and enforcers. And the other one is, which is linked to that, is that I think consumer law so far has always been seen and used as a tool to enhance economic welfare and economic development. And I think from this point on, it should be thought of slightly differently, in that it can do that and it can be a very useful tool to enhance economic development, but it's also important to start seeing consumer law as a tool to combat social exclusion. And I think the responses from enforcement agencies and the responses from governments give me confidence that this shift, although maybe hasn't yet been labelled, but it's already happening. Yes, when states stop a price going up and up and up and put a price cap, as a reaction, they are starting to acknowledge that people will not be able to procure themselves with those goods. And therefore, consumer law is not just about economic welfare and competitive markets, it's also about social welfare of citizens. And consumer law traditionally has separated those two entities. When we are consumers, in consumer law, normally we're not citizens. We have a different persona that is taken. And I think the pandemic for me has shifted this view, and we should start to reconnect people as consumers with the rest of their individuality. That it's very important to understand people holistically as well, and that helps in understanding vulnerabilities, because we are all vulnerable to different degrees in different ways. And if we want consumer laws and enforcement to continue to respond to human needs effectively, it's quite important to make that shift. So that's the first point. And the second point, where I've got a lot less information to date, but it seems to me that for enforcers in particular, there's going to be a need to really leapfrog into the 21st century. And that is no criticism of enforcers. Enforcers around the world, from everything that I've observed, are fantastic and so dedicated to helping consumers, but often with very, very, very slim budgets or a real lack of tools. So I think there needs to be some thoughts around how to leapfrog into using software, using AI, as opposed to trying to catch up with developments. The scammers are already on it. Big businesses are already using AI, are trying to completely monitor, interpret, anticipate consumer needs. And I think the next challenge for enforcement is really to try and do the same in order to bring appropriate responses. So I think that's perhaps the point that I want to leave you with, which is, yes, we need to firefight today, but as enforcers and as policymakers, it's also really important to start thinking of tomorrow and think about it now. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves again in that situation at the next shock, as Liz was discussing. That's all my comments. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rifa, for your intervention, which highlighted the importance of enforcement of consumer rights and laws and the need for policymakers to take into consideration social welfare, especially for vulnerable consumers. I would like now to move to our next speaker in this panel, Mr. Arnaud Itzagiri. I will also pose the same questions to Mr. Arnaud, whose intervention will focus on product safety, business engagement, and international cooperation. Please, Arnaud, you have the floor for 10 minutes for your intervention.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Then I will share with you my presentation. Let me know if you can see it. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak and also for hosting this joint webinar, which is the first, I believe, between UNCTAD and ESCWA in the field of consumer protection, and which describes very well in this new trend of interpreting consumer protection as something going further than economic development and also into social protection, which I'm queuing into what Christine was saying earlier. I will focus my presentation on this question: if there is a potential shift for digitalization and more reliance on online activities in response to and in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the first thing that I noticed, and this also cues Dr. Nibal's intervention, is that the transition towards the digital economy is already here. It's just being accelerated. So from our UNCTAD Digital Economy Report of 2019, we see that the global value of e-commerce was $29 trillion or 36% of world GDP, and that the global value of business-to-consumer e-commerce was $3.9 billion United States dollars, which is only 13% of the total. But it also means a 22% growth in relation to the previous year. And even more so in ESCWA's member states, as the exponential growth happens, especially in the MENA region, with an increase of 41% in data traffic and 35% in cloud traffic. I will not dwell very deeply on the positioning of ESCWA member states because Dr. Nibal was very eloquent in this point. But let me just mention that in the top 10 developing countries, business-to-consumer UNCTAD index of 2019, we have 3 ESCWA member states, UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia, although overall positions are relatively low. For example, the first ESCWA member, UAE, is number 28 in the world ranking. Let me now move to the challenges that we see in the COVID-19, and I can only echo what Liz and Christine were saying before. First is the digital divide. That is a change in consumer behavior towards the digital economy, raises concern over access, and Liz was also talking about
Excuse me, Arnaud, I think we can hear an echo in the background. Just maybe you can adjust the speaker a little bit.
Okay, give me a second then. Shuki, il t'entend. Il me l'ont dit. Can you hear me now? Is it better? Is it better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I was talking about this digital divide among countries, but also within countries. And I think both Liz and Christine have dwelt into this. And the new challenges to online consumers. And this is what Teresa's intervention was about price gouging of essential consumer goods, misleading advertisement scams, refund policies, information campaigns and complaints, and also the importance of business engagement. So what is the guide for this digital shift? The guide that we have are the UN guidelines for consumer protection. They were adopted first in 1985, expanded in 1999, and deeply revised in 2015 by the General Assembly. to respond to those current challenges. These guidelines are very useful because they cover most of consumer policy. So they cover not only the legitimate needs, but also national policies for consumer protection, the physical safety and standards for the safety and quality of consumer goods and services, the distribution facilities for essential goods and services, dispute resolution and redress, education and information programs, e-commerce and financial services, good business practices, and international cooperation. Let's see a little bit more in detail what they entail, and in particular in relation to the topic that we're discussing. First of all, the consumer legitimate needs, or as they refer to as the consumer rights that are recognized worldwide, is first the protection of consumers from hazards to their health and safety, which has gained importance due to business-to-consumer online trade. Also, the principle that consumer protection online should be not less than that afforded to other means of commerce, that is offline. That there is a renewed focus on the protection of vulnerable and disadvantaged consumers, and that we need to ensure effective consumer dispute resolution and redress. This feeds into the specific chapter on e-commerce within the United Nations Guidelines for Consumer Protection. They are the guidelines 63 to 65, and the main objectives are consumer confidence, transparency, again, that the level of protection is no less than that for online trade, and that member states evaluate whether there is need for adjustment of national laws and policies to accommodate for the special features of e-commerce. The guidelines also call for member states to empower consumers and inform both consumers and businesses of their rights and obligations in the digital marketplace, and they refer to other relevant international guidelines such as the OECD Consumer E-commerce Recommendations and ISO standards. Another section of the UN guidelines that is relevant today and that we've touched upon previously is international cooperation. We have the section from guidelines 79 to 94 that highlight the importance of enforcement and cross-border cooperation in protecting consumers, especially online consumers, and the possible coordinated actions against rogue traders at both regional and international levels. And here we have the International Consumer Protection Enforcement Network, but also regional frameworks such as the EU and other regional organizations. Regarding the post-COVID digital economy solutions needed to effect this shift, I would like to refer to Guideline 14, which are national policies for consumer protection, and they provide a checklist for policymakers and even enforcers to be able to assess whether their tools are ready to address post-COVID-19 challenges to consumer protection, or mid-COVID-19, we may say. The first is that national policies for consumer protection should encourage good business practices. And this comes to the idea that can only be effective in protecting consumers if businesses are engaged and appropriate consumer protection as a goal of their activities. And in here, we find that codes of conduct, regulation are important, but also that businesses should strive to better protect the privacy and complaint handling of consumers and to treat consumers in a fair way. National policies for consumer protection should also aim to establish clear and timely information to enable consumers to contact business and to know what the product is about. So not only the identity of the business, but also the characteristics of the project, of the products and services they're consuming. They should also aim for clear and timely information regarding goods and services offered by businesses and the terms and conditions of the relevant transaction. So again, on online transactions. And a second part of this guideline 14 is that member states should aim to provide policies that allow clear and concise and easy to understand contract terms that are not unfair. In the context of online commerce, cooling off periods are particularly important to allow consumers to have a calmer decision-making than the immediate tick, click, and hope for the best and immediacy that e-commerce entails. Also a transparent process for confirmation, cancellation, return and refund of transactions. And refund seems a growing importance in the midst of the COVID-19 situation, but also secure payment mechanisms that Dr. Niba was referring to in her intervention, fair and affordable and speedy dispute resolution and redress, including, of course, online dispute resolution as a main source for dispute resolution in the e-commerce sector, and also some kind of consumer relief in the form of chargebacks of escrow systems such as Alibaba or Alipay, in which consumers can find relief if they have differences with the trader, at least until the dispute has been decided upon. And finally, two important and major policy issues in e-commerce that are rising the interest of policymakers in the midst of the COVID-19 response are consumer privacy, data protection, and also consumer and business education. Let me reference here two UNCTAD tools that may be interesting for our audience. One is the Manual on Consumer Protection of 2017. It is our take of how to implement the new UN guidelines for consumer protection, and it has a chapter on e-commerce as well as international cooperation, but as well as product safety, etc. And also the UNCTAD note on consumer protection in electronic commerce of 2018, where you will find more examples of responses and challenges that developing and developed countries have given to consumer protection in this field. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Arnaud, for your intervention and for sharing the UN guidelines and tools on consumer protection policies and the needs to facilitate the shift to digital economy solutions post-COVID. Last but not least, I would like to introduce our last speaker for the day, Mr. Andreas Zygmunt, who is the Policy Officer at the European Commission. Mr. Zygmunt will give a short intervention on the actions of the EU Consumer Cooperation Network on road trading during the COVID-19 outbreak and the related screening of online platforms. Mr. Andreas, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, colleagues, and good morning to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank for our invitation. For me, it's the first time I'm attending your meeting. It was very interesting and very interesting to compare that you face similar challenges in very various regions that we did face in Europe. What was very clear from the beginning is that misinformation and disinformation were thriving throughout the COVID pandemic, and amongst these, we had to reflect on how to address best online consumer scams, which appeared very soon from the beginning of the pandemic. I'm working in the unit in the European Commission in DG Just, which is dealing for cross-border enforcement of EU consumer laws. So we were looking at very quickly what our network's role and benefit could be in this process. What we saw is that after the outbreak of the pandemic, member states first started looking at individual issues. But very soon they realized that the issues are very similar in the member states. So we needed to find a more harmonized approach, and we needed to activate basically the CPC network, which is the network of national enforcement authorities, to give an EU-level response for the challenges. So this led this network to very early on and in a record speed adopt a so-called common position, and this was adopted on the 20th of March already. And this common position outlined the main breaches of EU consumer law and the most typical practices the network identified which rogue traders carried out. And not surprisingly, these most common practices are very similar to what the previous speakers were mentioning. So we very quickly identified unsupported claims. To give you an example, if, for example, a mask is pretending to be COVID mask, which is protecting you from the infection in all cases, which is not supported by any scientific evidence, or there were also certain medical products or other similar products, food supplements, which which suggested that they would provide immunity against the virus, which was also not the case. The second identified issue which we put in the common position was pressure selling. So this was also a very important point we saw, where basically traders wanted to push consumers to buy without thinking, saying that there is only very limited stock left. And linked to this, we also identified excessive pricing, which was also something which many of the speakers mentioned. So this common position basically was outlining, as I mentioned, the main breaches of EU consumer law and the most important practices, and was intending to serve also as a guidance for the main internet operators to see what are the issues they should look at. And to reinforce this message, our commissioner, Mr. Didier Reinders, was writing to the 11 most important internet platforms and asked their cooperation with the CPC network, and asked them to take measures proactively and to introduce also a so-called notice and takedown procedure, which would help the authorities, the national enforcement authorities, to signal problematic listings, and that would also ensure that the platforms remove these listings from their sites. What was very positive, that all the platforms who we contacted, and these are really the biggest internet platforms, replied positively and replied with a strong commitment on consumer protection. And this once invitation for cooperation actually turned into a very active dialogue over the last months. So we are constantly communicating with the platforms, asking feedback from them, what they took, and we also signal to them new problems we identify. And what was the result of this very good cooperation is that already more than millions of infringing listings were removed from the platforms thanks to this action of the CPC network. And these dedicated channels were also established so that the national authorities can now send on a very secure way problematic issues to the platforms so that they can improve further their performance. Our network, the CPC network, which is the so-called Consumer Protection Cooperation Network, also carried out 2 online investigations, which we call sweeps, which basically is a coordinated consumer law compliance check in the digital world. And these were focusing on whether the platforms are compliant with the measures they took or indicated to take, and also they looked at individual websites. And we did one sweep in May, and now we did a second one in June, and we just last week published the results. It was still interesting and important to see that despite all the measures the platforms took, in nearly 1/3 of the cases, the authorities found still irregularities. So we are still not yet fully to say that we, let's say, cleaned the online world from these scams. We did very important steps, but we need to continue this work. So to complete this work, the network is now also looking to other avenues for cooperation. We started talking with online advertisers because this is something which we saw also as an important area, so that many consumers are going to the actual offers via online advertisement. And we also started discussions with the national domain registries. The Commission already made an agreement with the EUR ID domain registry, which is providing the .eu extensions to take extraordinary measures linked to the COVID pandemic. And there is also an ongoing discussion with an organization which is called Center, which is bringing together the national top-level domain registries to also reach for a similar solution. And it's very important to stress that despite in June we saw that the trends were going down, so we didn't have so many reported scams than as before. We have to remain on really high alert because we have to avoid that in case of a second wave, which is quite likely, we have to face similar challenges. And we remain on this high alert because during the pandemic it was very well proven that the CPC cooperation form, which is basically meaning that the national enforcement authorities are cooperating on an EU level action with the coordination of the Commission, was really a successful and effective tool. So we will keep on continuing this work. And thanks again for the invitation. It was very interesting to compare your experiences with ours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Andreas Zygmunt, for your intervention and for sharing the European Commission experience to mitigate the impact of the crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, this was our last intervention for the day. I would like to thank all our speakers for their invaluable contributions. I would like now to address some of our questions that we have received from the participants. We apologize again that we cannot answer all questions today because of lack of time. However, we will get back to you by email with an answer in case your question was not addressed. The first question from one of our participants, the participants wants to know if the pandemic will lead to actual change in terms of consumer protection, and how can we take advantage of the current conditions to bring about positive change and make a big leap in consumer protection in a sustainable way. I very much like this question actually because it gives a bit of a positive outlook on the crisis and looking at sort of the filled part of the glass, sort of what we can learn from it. I would like to direct this question to my colleague from UNCTAD, Ms. Teresa. Please, the floor is yours to comment.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you and congratulations to all the speakers for their interventions. I thought they were extremely interesting. And I think this encourages us, Natalie, this is for you, to explore further webinars in the near future. Again, I do think that one of the positive outcomes, if one can speak like this, of the pandemic was actually the assertiveness of consumer protection policy. I do agree with previous speakers, namely with Christine, that this is not, how can I put it, this is not really a given. I think consumer protection agencies across the globe were extremely quick and active in providing for consumer protection in concrete cases that were raised by the outbreak of the COVID-19. However, I do not think that this is a given, and I would like to underline something that Christine brought up in a very timely way. She talked about enforcement and policy making. I would actually refer to this as regarding the institutional design of consumer protection agencies, because somehow, well, most of you know, but again, UNCTAD has both competition and consumer protection mandates. I myself have been a competition enforcer and a consumer protection enforcer in a concrete area, and balance of design, of institutional design, the imbalance of instruments, the imbalance of concrete powers is almost shocking. So for competition law and policy, competition authorities are now independent, and they get a set of tools, a set of means, even a budgetary means, to hire the best qualified lawyers and economists. They are able to impose very heavy fines. They are able to conduct what is called as down raids, so inspections, surprise inspections to companies. All of this to say that competition law and competition policy are recognized as being so important within the range of public policies that any government pursues, that competition law enforcers are given these means to very actively and very effectively stop competition infringements and to take action against these infringements and infringers in order to restore competition in the market. I can only say that I wish consumer protection law and policy would get almost the same attention. And this is what we do not really see all over the world. Of course, there are a lot of exceptions. We just heard from our colleague from the European Commission, and I'm very happy to see that, for instance, in the UK, the Competition and Markets Authority is the competition and consumer protection law enforcer. In Italy, the Italian Competition Authority has competence to enforce consumer protection law, and it does it effectively. And of course, I can think of the United States of America, etc. And of course, just to name a few. But it is true that usually consumer protection agencies are not provided with the same high-level mandate, even though we are all consumers, even though, well, I would say the audience, the addressees are much wider, but at least call with our CI experience knows this better than anybody, but consumers don't speak with a single voice. So you address consumers, but only some consumers pick up the message, only some probably feel connected. And this is really an issue that in the end affects as a negative impact in the consumer protection law enforcement and in the recognition of the relevance of consumer protection. I just wanted also to say that because interestingly, Christine also touched upon social exclusion. I also think that consumer protection is a part of social protection in broad terms. I should say that the United Nations launched a number of responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, and development accounts, technical cooperation projects were launched, and UNCTAD is actually partnering in a project that is addressing social protection, where we were able to attach consumer protection. It is an interesting project led by ESCWA, but not necessarily the colleagues that are currently online, unfortunately. But it's quite interesting, and I say this to Dr. Nibal because maybe you are not aware of this. This project, so consumer protection connected to the broad umbrella of social protection, we actually are focusing on health services and on e-health services. So in a way, it's something that also involves your section. I'm sorry, I don't know if you are fully aware of this, but this is to say, I do believe that consumer policy should be one of the key public policies, because it concerns all consumers, meaning all citizens, and several aspects. And what Liz mentioned, the concern of consumers with privacy, with data protection, that goes beyond just our actions as consumers. That concerns our rights as citizens across the world. So it is extremely important to fully explore all of this. So to conclude, I do believe that this is the right time to push forward for a more inclusive, broader, more effective consumer protection policy. I do believe very much in the achievements of course, regional cooperation. And Dr. Nibal made a very good case that even in the Arab region, there are several regions that have, I would say, very little to do with each other. For instance, the post-conflict countries have nothing to do with some of the Gulf countries that are so developed. But this does not mean to say that we should not be able to share experiences, trying to increase understanding and protection, and especially also to encourage neighbors to assist each other in case of need. Thank you very much, Natalie.
Thank you very much, Teresa, for your comments. And it's always a pleasure actually to cooperate with UNCTAD on different fronts in many projects. And we hope that this will not be our final webinar. So we'll be doing a lot of webinars in the future on this subject. Our second question that we would like to address is how the consumer protection authorities in the Arab region could cooperate with each other to handle consumer issues related to the COVID-19. If I may comment a little bit, and then maybe I'll give the floor back to you, Teresa. I think we all agree that international coordinated action is needed to respond to the challenges brought about by the crisis. However, when in reality, most nations have responded to the crisis in an individual manner and enforced the national measures instead of coordinated measures on a regional or international basis. Now, how can we cooperate? Consumer protection agencies, I think, around the world should exchange information, data, research results as quickly as possible to understand what upcoming measures they should take in the fight against the crisis. Coordinated action is essential in formulating plans to help countries and communities rebuild their economies and societies. Arab countries have been sharing their knowledge and experiences through the COVID-19 pandemic on different platforms, And with this webinar today, we aim to create a platform for Arab consumer protection agencies to share their experience and knowledge and learn from each other, while also learning from best practices from the international community. While this is a first step, as I was saying, in the right direction, more needs to be done to improve direct cooperation and our response mechanisms to times of crisis. And this is what I wanted to say regarding this point on cooperation, but please, the floor is yours if you want to add any other comments.
Well, thank you very much, Natalie. Let me just say, I would like also to hear our guest speakers on this. Well, of course, this is what we do. We do policy advice, we meaning at UNCTAD, while the UN, all the UN agencies, regional economic commissions, we exist to serve our member states. But I do believe, and this is what I have seen since UNCTAD was granted a formal mandate on consumer protection, we are often approached by colleagues from consumer agencies or from ministries when these don't exist, asking us how we can support them and not necessarily being able to identify what are the priorities. So I do think that there is always a need for raising awareness even of our counterparts, because, you know, in a Ministry of Trade or Economy or in a sector-specific ministry or sector-specific regulators are not always necessarily aware of what they can do to protect consumers in their field of action. So there's still quite a lot of outreaching to do, I believe, all the time. I do think that the regional setting like we have here is easier. It's easier despite the huge differences. I should say that through our UNCTAD MENA program, and this only covered 7 North African and Middle East countries, we did notice the huge differences from country to country. Well, some countries, for instance, being much more advanced in competition law and policy than in consumer protection law and policy. In other cases, the other way around. But this means to say that gathering, Natalie, not only our counterparts in the government, so the consumer protection agencies or ministry representatives, but gathering stakeholders. I should say that one of the most positive achievements from our UNCTAD MENA program was actually to bring together stakeholders that, believe it or not, even from neighbor countries had never met, from consumer associations, from business associations, from academia, from judiciary. So these relevant stakeholders that are also necessarily fully engaged for a more effective consumer protection policy. But I don't know, Natalie, maybe Christine, Liz, of course, and our other colleagues would like to add something.
Yeah, yes, Dr. Rifa, please go ahead.
Okay, perhaps I can. Oh, I'm good now. Okay. Well, thanks, Teresa. It's a big ask. It's a broad question, and I obviously don't have the experience that everyone has on the at the front end of all those problems. I think for me, perhaps the comments I like to make is, yes, that there needs to be this rebalancing of consumer protection and competition law. That in all of the work that I have done, what you notice is that consumer protection is normally subservient to competition policy, that it's just seen as a tool, and that indeed creates problems. I've written a book, sorry to advertise, but all the thinking is actually in that book, on consumer theories of harm, which is actually looking at economic theories and how we can use them to protect consumers more effectively in enforcement policy and in enforcement. And we really, with the co-authors I was working with, one being an economist for the Bank of England in the UK and another one being an enforcer, we came to this idea that consumer law tools could actually be really performant, and in some setup, they can actually be really cheap compared to letting a market on a downward spiral, getting really, really, really bad for consumers, and then having to devote a lot of money and efforts to changing the structure of a market. Whereas in fact, sometimes with early intervention with consumer law, notably on unfair commercial practices, you can really change the nature of the behavior of market actors. And that actually is a plus for enforcers, that they might not need to think of all problems as a competition problems, that sometimes competition problems can also be solved with consumer protection tools. So I think I would really strongly try to emphasize the point Teresa was making on looking how we can rebalance this relationship between consumer protection and competition enforcement, because I think they should be thought of as being equal and working in tandem. So I think member states would benefit of thinking of competition and consumer protection as a holistic package that can help them monitor markets and make sure markets are fair. And the conclusion of that book was actually we should start thinking of fairness by design rather than expecting consumers to be the enforcers of competition policies and consumer protection policies.
Thank you very much, Christine, for this final comments. I am actually pleased to have with us, who joined just right now, Dr. Muhammad Al-Mustafa Wild Aliya, who is the Director of Competition, Consumer Protection and Fraud Prevention at the Mauritania Ministry of Trade. Mr. Mustafa would like to give a short intervention on the Mauritanian experience. دكتور مصطفى محمد المصطفى ولد عليا، الرجاء اطلاعنا على تجربة موريتانيا وأبرز التحديات التي واجهها المستهلكون في موريتانيا منذ بداية الوباء، وما هي الإجراءات التي اتخذتموها لحماية المستهلكين وتخفيف أثر الوباء في موريتانيا. Unfortunately, we lost Dr. Mustafa. I think he has some technical issues with his speaker. I now would like to actually give the floor to our other speakers, Ms. Cole or Ms. Idlibi, for your final comments and whether you would like to add anything as a final remark.
Thank you. I actually need to leave very quickly, so this is just very brief. And I was thinking back to the last question about cooperation and the range of stakeholders, and I think my main message would be don't forget the cooperation of consumer associations on the ground in different countries, and there is already a movement and a network that is there and which is based very heavily on networking and sharing, and with access to complaints data or on the ground research with consumers who are facing the very deep difficulties for these issues. We're also seeing lots of innovation from lots of consumer associations working much more with the tech for good community, so looking at how open data or consumer data can be used not just to package up and target and sell you more things, but can be used to express what consumer wants and desires are in markets. And I think that has a huge amount of potential in terms of collective switching or collective buying, and really helping consumers have a bit more of a joint voice to be able to push markets. So that was my final comments. Thank you.
Very much, Ms. Cole. Ms. Idlibi, would you like to give some final words for today and probably highlight about the regional intervention and the regional cooperation needed to move this forward?
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I mean, about the collaboration, for sure. I mean, I agree with Ms. Teresa, and I agree with all speakers that collaboration is really very much needed at regional level and even at a global level. This is very important, and I believe as regional commission, we are really supporting Arab countries to exchange good practices and so on. And we hear that. I mean, I believe we are playing in a way similar role as UNCTAD, but UNCTAD do it at a global level, and thanks to all your efforts, because really there is a lot of manual that you are doing that are really very helpful. But I want to say that collaboration among country and within the country, it is really very important. Collaboration among different stakeholders. It was mentioned even by Mr. Andras from the EU. He mentioned how the collaboration between the private sector association as well as government, they are really crucial for consumer protection. Wherever there is citizen, I mean the NGO and association they are playing very important role. And I believe in the Arab region we have to enforce that, and not to enforce it, but to encourage it and promote the importance of collaboration among sectors. I mean, I am happy to collaborate with you, Natalie, in this. We are technology and you are more in consumer protection. This collaboration it is really very much needed. And as we all know, SDG, the UN Development Agenda call for such collaboration across sector between among different stakeholders to complement each efforts, because I mean, silo is not helping, and we have witnessed that in many countries that silo are not really helping neither country nor citizen nor institutions. Then this is what I have, but if you need me to summarize the finding of the session, I'm ready to do so. So, Natalie, whenever you find it suitable.
Thank you very much, Nibal, and I actually would like to, if you allow me, to give some final comments on the importance of the discussions that took place on the law and enforcement that promote consumer protection. I would like to highlight in this regard an ESCWA study that we did on the business environment legislative framework in the region. And our preliminary findings actually indicate that consumer protection legislations are the weakest area of business legislations within the region. This is partly because consumer protection is an emerging field in the Arab region, receiving renewed focus after the uprisings that took place beginning of 2011, in which consumers and price controls became more impactful for the public. While many states have some form of consumer protection legislation, institutions designated to implement this law frequently lack clarity on enforcement mechanisms and the ability to follow up effectively. Also, in many of these countries, the law applies only to traditional forms of consumption, while overlooking new and emerging forms like e-commerce, for example, as indicated by my colleague also, Dr. Reddy. In times of COVID and the crisis, we all felt the importance of having well-established regulatory and institutional foundations to protect consumers and implement fair business practice. We will be sharing the results of our study with each member state to support their regulatory reforms. We also heard the importance of cooperation and coordination. Perhaps next steps, and I shared Teresa, where we can ESCWA and support the region, is to establish probably a network for Arab consumer protection agencies to enable them and promote and encourage wide participation and cooperation with each other on consumer protection policies and enforcement mechanisms. Probably this can be our next action. Unfortunately, I think we passed a little bit the allotted time for us. We will need to wrap it here for time reasons. I would like to thank you very much again for your time and for your participation. I would like to thank our co-hosts from UNCTAD and all of our esteemed speakers again for your commitment and for sharing your invaluable experience. A big thank you goes to, again, the participants for showing interest in this very important topic and for attending our webinar today. I thank our team at ESCWA as well, who supported in the organization of this webinar, and our translators who are translating live through the chat box on YouTube. Thank you again, everyone. I wish you safe and healthy days ahead and until we meet again. مع ألف سلامة.